Jeremy Keyes talks about this idea of material honesty. So using the right tool for the job. But CSS keeps getting new superpowers. And now it can be like a little bit overwhelming, perhaps, if you're not deeply immersed in the world of CSS layout. So we have functions like min, max, and clamp. We have logical properties and values, container queries now supported in all browsers, subgrid, the has, pseudo class, parent selector, and the list goes on. So the goal of this talk is to highlight some of these new features and demonstrate some ways that we can use them. Because many of these features are things that developers have been asking for a long time. And they work best when we embrace the web's inherent flexibility, when we stop chasing pixel perfection and instead of trying to describe it like exactly how a layout should render at all times, give the browser hints. Let it make informed choices based on content and context. So as my friend Andy says, be the browser's mentor, not its micromanager. And that's something I try to keep in mind when I'm building layout. So let's run through a few small CSS features that might have kind of flown under the radar a little bit. These are one-liners or two-liners just to make life a little bit easier when building layouts for the web. And the first one is the aspect ratio property. So I love aspect ratio because with one line of code, it eliminates the need for a whole lot of hacky CSS. So previously, this on the left was how we would set an aspect ratio on an element in CSS. And, this was definitely not fun. Nobody wants to be writing this stuff. But now we have just this one-line aspect ratio property. And what I like about it is it acts like a kind of minimum aspect ratio. So this box has an aspect ratio of 3:2. But if I put some longer text content in there, then that box is just going to grow. It still preserves that kind of flexibility that we need from the web. And it works great with our flex and grid layouts too. So we have this card here, which is laid out using flexbox with an image on the left. And that image has the object fit value set to cover. So no matter how the size changes, the image will still, cover that area without being stretched or squashed. And that image is always going to be at least that aspect ratio, so that width in relation to its height. But if we put some more text content on the right-hand side, then that image is just going to grow as well. And that's because with Flexbox, the default align items property is set to stretch. So if you grow one column, then the other one grows as well. And that works pretty nicely for a card like this. And perhaps if you don't want that behavior, you can set the align items property on the image to start or end or center or whatever you want. But for this kind of layout, that works pretty well. Next, we have the gap property in Flexbox. Now, we've had gap in grids almost since the beginning. It used to be called grid gap, but then it was changed to gap so that it would be compatible with Flexbox. And that controls how we space out our items in a flex or grid layout. And it does make it easier to build layouts with Flexbox. So we have these breadcrumbs here, which are laid out using Flexbox. And that, we might typically space them out using margins or padding. And we'll probably set the flex wrap property to wrap so that if the viewport or the available space gets narrower, our items are just going to wrap onto the next line. Now, at the moment, our items are going to crash into each other because we don't have any sort of margins set on those items. You can see, the bottom one is hitting up against the top one. So, we'll probably add bottom margin to each of those flex items. And then we're left with this sort of leftover space at the bottom of our component because we don't know exactly at what point they're going to wrap. We don't know, how long our content's going to be and how wide the user's viewport is. So, I don't know about you, but I quite like my component to be able to be isolated and not affect the rest of my layout. So using the gap property instead, we're not left with those leftover margins. It just makes it a little bit nicer and a little bit easier to isolate that component. And the gap value can take two values for the column gap and row gap, or block axis and inline axis, which I'm using here, or you can use a single value. We also have some new and improved viewport units. So hopefully we all agree that viewport units are awesome, and we've been able to size elements relative to the height or width of the viewport for quite a long time now in CSS. But if we want kind of a full height section on our web page, we can use 100 VH to set that so that it takes up the full viewport height. But on mobile devices, 100 VH can mean different things because it's influenced by the dynamic toolbars that scroll into or out of view as the user scrolls. So if you have some important content at the bottom of your 100 VH section, then that's going to be perhaps hidden by these dynamic toolbars. So what we can do instead is use small, large, or dynamic viewport units. And just to kind of highlight where this becomes a problem, like I've been on quite a lot of websites where there's been a cookie banner in view, and I haven't been able to click the button to accept or reject the cookies because it's hidden by those dynamic toolbars on mobile. So this is where these viewport units help us out. So small viewport height will resolve to the smallest height of the viewport. So that's the height with the toolbars visible. LVH, or large viewport height, will resolve to the height with the toolbars retracted. And DVH, or dynamic viewport height, will actually resize the element as those toolbars expand or retract. You do need to be a little bit careful with that because the resizing isn't smooth, it's throttled, so you might still get a bit of jumping with the layout. Now, these units are only really useful so far for mobile layout with those dynamic toolbars. They're kind of specifically designed to help with that use case. And they don't take into account things like scroll bars on the width axis on desktop, for example. But for mobile layouts, they're pretty handy. Now, how often do we want to place one element on top of another one in CSS? Well, for me, it's pretty often. And a typical way to do that would be with absolute positioning, using the top, right, bottom, and left properties. So I've got this caption I want to overlay on this image. I'm going to use position absolute, and then top, right, bottom, and left set to 0. Or we could use width and height instead of some of those properties. But now we have this one-liner, this inset property, which is basically a shorthand for top, bottom, left, right. So if we set that to 0, then our caption is just going to completely cover our image, which is quite nice. And because it's a shorthand, it takes multiple values as well. So the shorthand for top, bottom, left, right can be different values in there. And we have inset block and inset inline, which control the inset value on the block axis. So that's the vertical axis if we're using a Western writing mode, or the inline axis, which will be the width or horizontal axis. So you can see this is set to 50 pixels from either side of our element. And it also takes negative values, just like the top, bottom, and left, right properties. Now, there is another way of positioning items on top of each other that doesn't involve absolute positioning, and that is using grid. So if we make our entire figure a grid using the display property with a value of grid, and then we place all of that element's direct children into the same grid cell, then they're going to be stacked on top of each other. And that works pretty nicely. You can see it actually works slightly differently than absolute positioning because it maintains the padding on our grid. So we've got this black border, and then we've got a small amount of padding within the parent element. So rather than completely overlaying that element, they're just going to be placed inside it, into the same grid cell. And this actually has an advantage at times over absolute positioning because if we have like a really long caption in here, we have like much more text than we're expecting, then that grid cell is going to grow to accommodate it. So it's a bit more flexible in that way. You can see also here, I'm using these nested selectors because we can now do native nesting in CSS. We don't need a preprocessor for that, which is very cool. That's really supported in, I think, like all browsers now, possibly. So yay, CSS. Okay, we also have some keywords for intrinsic sizing. So sizing elements relative to the content. So we have min content, max content, and fit content. So doing something like this is usually a pretty bad idea, like hard coding a width of, say, 300 pixels when we don't know what the content is going to be, and we get overflow like this. So probably don't want to do that too often. But we could make this box sized to its content using the min content property. And what that will do is it will set the size according to the longest word in the text string. So it will wrap the text at each available opportunity. It'll be sized to the longest word. Now, if we have something else in there that has larger intrinsic width, like an image, which maybe it's, say, 600 pixels, then the min content size for that box will be the size of the image, so say 600 pixels. And then max content kind of does the opposite. It will not wrap the text. So if you have a really long paragraph of text, it's going to be sized to the length of that entire paragraph. So it's going to overflow the viewport potentially if you have some really long text in there. There aren't too many occasions where I've had to use this value, but if you know the length of your content, then perhaps it is useful sometimes. And then we have fit content, which is quite similar and certainly looks the same on first glance. But the difference here is that if we resize the viewport, it will actually resize the element and wrap the text all the way down to the min content value. So I have an example here where I'm using fit content. So these headings with the thick underlines that are trailing off to the left, like I think we're going to stop in a minute. There we go. There's one. They are sized using fit content. So they will be sized to the length of the text. And then I'm absolute positioning an element aligned to the right of those headings to act as the underline, so it will trail all the way off to the left of the screen. Now, I just want to briefly mention Subgrid, because I know Rachel Andrew has talked about Subgrid at this conference a couple of times now, I think. And at the time, it was only supported in Firefox. It actually took other browsers quite a long time to catch up. But now Subgrid is supported in all major browsers. And it allows any of a grid's children to inherit the grid of its parent. It's part of the level 2 grid specification. So let's have a look at a quick example. So we have these two cards here, and they have different content in the top, middle, and bottom sections. But we might want each of those sections to align with the other section, with the other cards in the row. Now, without Subgrid, neither card is aware of the other one's content. But we could make each card span 3 rows of the parent grid, and then we could use a grid template rows value of Subgrid so that they will inherit the parent grid on the row axis. And now our content aligns across all the cards in the row. And we can actually override the gap value in our subgrids as well. So if you can imagine on the parent grid, we probably have a row gap value because we want to maintain the space between the cards above and below this one, perhaps. But inside the cards themselves, we can override that and reset it to 0 or set it to some other value. So let's talk more about responsive layouts in general. So I'm guessing everyone here is fairly familiar with responsive design, but it just got a lot better, a lot easier with CSS. The most common way to build responsive layouts would be with media queries, but they have some limitations. Suppose we have this grid of 3 columns, and maybe we want to take it and put it into a narrower space, like a sidebar, or maybe we have like an advert or some other element that we suddenly want to plonk on the other side of the page, so our card grid has less room. We don't want it to still have 3 columns. We want it to probably stack like it does on mobile. But a media query based on viewport size is not going to detect that our grid is now in a narrower space. So let's look at some alternative ways we can build this grid. So at the moment, we have this card grid, so this wrapper around our cards with display grid. And right now, it just has a single column. So our cards are taking up the full width of the grid. Now we're going to use the grid template columns property, and we're going to use the repeat function with a value of autofill. And what that will do is it will create as many columns as it needs to fill up the space. And the width of for the width of our columns, our column size, we're going to use the min-max function. So min-max, you can determine the minimum size and the maximum size for our column tracks. So we're saying it needs to be a minimum of 18 rems wide for each column and a maximum of 1 FR. So an FR is a fraction unit, a fraction of our grid width. So now we have responsive grid. Let's resize the browser and make sure that works. Yep, great. All the way down. Oh, okay, so when we get down to super narrow sizes, our card is going to overflow because it needs to be a minimum of 18 rems. So instead, let's try that again. We're going to use the repeat function once again, the autofill. This time, inside the min-max function, we'll use the CSS min function. Now, the min function takes 2 or more values, and it will pick the smallest one. So if we give it 2 values, 18 rems and 100%, if 100% is less than 18 rems, it will pick 100% space, or if it's more, then it will pick 18 rems. So now resize the browser, and our grid should be responsive all the way down to super narrow sizes. So, that's great. Hooray, maybe we don't need to do anything more, and maybe this solves the problem. But I can think of 1 or 2 disadvantages with it. So first of all, I don't think this is a particularly intuitive way to build a responsive grid. I think, especially for somebody coming in, fairly new to CSS, that probably looks a little bit confusing. It's hard to see what's going on there. That's not an insurmountable problem, though. We have documentation for that, But there are some other disadvantages too. So first of all, we don't know at what point our layout is going to go from 2 columns to 3 columns. So if we want to apply some additional styling at that point, like giving our grid a border or a background color or something, well, we can't do that. We don't know when it's going to happen unless, we do some fancy calc. I'm sure somebody has done it somewhere. We also don't have control over the number of columns in our grid. So we can't go from, say, a 2-column layout to a 4-column layout. We have to have all the steps in between. So this doesn't solve every problem. A different way we could do this is by querying the width of a parent element or container. And of course, I'm talking about container queries. So let's build this layout instead with container queries. So once again, we have our grid is a single column. We have a main and a side element. So the main element is the white area on the left. The side element is the gray area on the right. And we're going to use the container property. Container is shorthand for container name and container type. The name is optional. You can use just the container type property. I like to give all my containers a name because it makes it much clearer to see which containers you're querying when it comes to writing our container queries. So our container name is layout and the type is inline size, which if you're, once again, using Western writing mode, that's going to correspond to the width, the horizontal axis. And then we can write our container query. So it's similar to writing a media query, except instead we use @container instead of @media. Our container's name, if you don't use the container name, then it's just going to query the closest ancestor container. And we're saying if the inline size is greater than 700 pixels, then set our grid template columns property to 2 column. Make it as a 2-column grid. So that worked. Great. Also, just a quick note on the syntax here. So with a media query, we're probably quite used to writing sort of min width, max width. Here we're saying inline size is greater than 700 pixels. And that's a new logical property friendly syntax. You can actually use this with media queries now as well. And also we're going to bump our layout up to 3 columns once we get to larger sizes. So we're going to say if the inline size is greater than 1200 pixels, we make this a 3-column layout. So now if we resize the browser, we should see that we have exactly the same as before. We have a responsive grid, but we've done that with container queries instead. But when we get to sort of medium tablet sizes, maybe just before we switch to the next sort of column size up, I think our cards are getting quite wide. They maybe don't look as good. So what we could do instead is give our cards a horizontal layout when they get a bit too wide. And to do that, we need to make the parent element of each card into a container. So in this case, it's the list item. It's like a wrapper around each card. We'll set that as a container as well. We'll call it card, and the type, once again, is inline size. And then let's write another container query. So we're saying when our card has an inline size greater than 450 pixels, make this a grid and make it have 2 columns. So now, hopefully, if we resize the browser, you can see at some of those kind of in-between sizes, those cards are now 2 columns. They have this kind of bit nicer horizontal layout. And of course, we could, tweak the values until we're sort of happy with the size that those are changing at. Now, the other thing that might be quite nice to do is when we have kind of leftover sort of orphan items at the bottom of our grid, maybe that doesn't look so great sort of sitting on its own down there. So maybe let's make the top element in our grid, the first item, span more columns so that we always have like a nice, neat grid. So we're going to do that inside our container query that we've already written. So where the inline size is greater than 1200 pixels. So we're already making this into a 3-column grid at that point. And now we're going to use the has selector, the scary looking selector, which I'm going to talk us through one step at a time. So the has pseudo class or parent selector allows us to select an element based on what it has inside it, essentially. So we're saying when our card grid has a last child that is a multiple of 3 minus 2, so when it basically has that kind of orphan item hanging about on its own, then style the first child of our grid by making it span 3 columns. So yeah, has is really fun. So now we're making that top item span 3 columns. It doesn't look too great at the moment because it still has really small text. We don't have much padding. Let's make that a bit better. So now we're going to style some padding and font size within our card. And we're going to use the clamp function. So the clamp function takes 3 values and it will pick the middle one. And that's super useful when you have sort of dynamic sizing. So if you're doing any kind of fluid typography or fluid spacing, then we can use clamp with viewport units, and that will sort of resize our fonts and spaces relative to the viewport, which is really nice. And what we're doing with having these fixed sizes is we're kind of those sizes are acting as locks. So we're saying for the padding, take that as an example, our padding should never be smaller than 1 rem. It should never be larger than 3 rems. But in between, we're going to scale that, and we're going to scale it relative to the container with this CQI unit. That's query container inline unit. So that's kind of the equivalent to doing like viewport width with viewport sizing. But here we're using container relative sizing. And we're doing that with the font size as well. So now those are scaling really nicely. So just a rundown of container relative units. We have query container width and query container height, which is similar to viewport width and viewport height. Then we have CQI and CQB, which are inline size and block size. So we were using CQI in inline size, and then CQ min and CQ max, which pick the smallest and largest respectively, just like with Theme and Vmax in viewport sizing. And you can use container queries everywhere now. They're supported in all major browsers. But if you are concerned about supporting older browsers and you do want to use container queries, there's a really good polyfill by the Chrome team, and it works with container units as well. And here's a quick demo of that same grid where you can see we're sort of expanding this sidebar, and you can see that it's working for us as we want it to, because it's going from sort of that 3-column to the 2-column grid. And I wanted to show you this quickly as well because we're using animated grid tracks for that to expand that sidebar, because we can animate CSS grid tracks. This demo actually is not using JavaScript at all. It's all CSS. I don't recommend you implement this exactly as I'm doing here, though, because it definitely has some accessibility holes. But I mainly wanted to show you that for the animated grid track, and so you can see our responsive grid in action. If you're interested in doing like fluid sizing, like fluid typography and spacing, I really, really recommend this tool, Utopia. So you basically give it a couple of values for your minimum and maximum viewport sizes, and it just spits out a whole load of custom properties based on clamp, and it's all kind of scaled using modular scaling, and you just drop those right into your CSS without even having to think about it. Super great and super useful. It's like one of my favorite tools for responsive layouts and responsive sizing. Now we saw a little bit of what has can do, the has pseudo class or parent selector. And I really like the idea that we can style our layout differently depending on how many items our grid has, or what it contains. So it allows us to style a parent, but it also allows us to style a sibling, because we're kind of like reaching up through the DOM and then kind of reaching back down again. It's really fun. So we could show like a different layout for our component depending on whether a particular element is present. So we have this grid component. It has a block quote that we position like this with the text center aligned. But if that quote has an accompanying image, then maybe we'll just like lay out our grid differently. We'll shift items around and we'll align the text to the left. We can do that with has. And we can also do a similar thing for, say, like a figure. We could lay that out differently depending on whether a figure has a fig caption or not. So this is all stuff we can do right now. It's now supported in all browsers. But let's have a look at some CSS of the future. Let's have a look at anchor positioning. So quite often in CSS, we want to position an element relative to another element. And we saw that a little bit earlier using the insect property. So we might want to position something directly on top of an element, or maybe off to the left, off to the side, like a tooltip. So like this. So in a document, we want these like tooltips to appear when we click on one of these references. So on click or on hover, one of these like little references within the document. Now, we'd probably do that with absolute positioning. We'd need to make a wrapper element and then have that positioned. And then, so we have like maybe position relative on wrapper, and then like absolute position our tooltip sort of below the button there. But with anchor positioning, we can position an element relative to pretty much any other element. They don't need to share a common ancestor. They don't have to be like next to each other in the DOM. They can be anywhere. Great. So the way we do that is by setting up an anchor. So the thing that's going to be that anchor in this case is the button. This is a button. Doesn't look like a button, but it is a button that we click on, and that needs an anchor name using the anchor name property. So we're calling this anchor 1 very imaginatively, and it uses this dashed ident syntax. If you're familiar with custom properties, you can see this looks kind of similar to how you'd like set up not how you'd set up a custom property, but like the custom property naming. And then we can absolute position our tooltip but we're going to use the position anchor property to say we want it anchored to this particular anchor that we've defined. So we're referencing the original anchor here. And then we use the inset area property to say where we want that positioned relative to the anchor. So here we're saying we want it at the bottom left of the anchor. And with inset area, we have a limited number of options available to us for positioning. We can say position at the bottom left, bottom right, top left, center. But we don't have that much control if we want to really tweak the positioning. So instead, we could use this anchor function. So the anchor function is used within our positioning properties. So with the top and right properties here, it takes the anchor name. So we're anchoring it to anchor 1 here. And we're saying we want it to align to the bottom right of this anchor. Or we can use percentage values. I don't know why it doesn't take like pixel values or sort of length values, but it doesn't. But it takes percentage values. So I'm going to say like I want it to be 150% from the top of the anchor, because actually, maybe we want to leave a bit of room for the little kind of arrow thing. I don't know what you call it from the bubble. So let's shift it down a bit and then off to the right a little bit more. But, maybe we don't always know exactly where we want to position our element relative to the anchor, because if the element is close to the edge of the viewport, in this text, the position is going to change depending on how big your viewport is and that kind of thing. Then maybe we want to place this tooltip not just to the bottom left, but we want to place it wherever there's room. So if you click this one on the right, then we'll position it at the bottom left. But if you click this one over here on the left, then, it'd be much better to place it at the bottom right. Now, we can do this in CSS with the position try at rule. So we're not in Kansas anymore. This is a new crazy CSS. So let's explain this a little bit. So position try, new at rule, and we basically are creating new positions with this. So we give our position a name, like pos left, the top one, pos right is the bottom one. And then we're using our position properties and the anchor function to define the different positions. So pos left is where we want our anchored element to be on the left, bottom left. Pos right is where we want it to be on bottom right here. And then using this position try options property, and we're saying to the browser, try positioning it first in one place and then in the other. So first of all, try positioning it on the right. If there's not enough room, then position it on the left. And then we're using the position try order property, and we're saying position it where there is the most width. So use that as the rule to determine the positioning. Cool. So this is the actual demo in action. That all works in Chrome and maybe Edge. Not in any other browsers at the moment. And this is actually done without any JavaScript at all. This is all done with the Popover API. So Popover is HTML, just lets us kind of open popovers wherever we want, not using any JavaScript. So these are all popovers. I'm not going to go into how that works now because we really don't have time. But we can also animate our popovers as well, because now in CSS we can animate from display none. So these actually have a little bit of animation as well. So yay, CSS. But if you do want to learn more about popovers, then I really recommend this talk by my friend Hida. He goes into like the whole Popover API, how it works, as well as dialogues. It's super good. You should definitely watch that. And just a quick note as well, we can use multiple anchors to anchor one element to like two different anchors. So that's what this is doing. So instead of having these little references as tooltips on click, we're positioning them in the document in line with where they're positioned in the text, but to the left or right of our content. So they're anchored vertically to the text anchor. So you can see this one aligns with the position in the content, but they're anchored horizontally to this content area here. And then we're just changing, we're just alternating, so position the first one on the right, second one on the left, and so on. So yay, multiple anchors. As I say, only supported in Chrome and Edge at the moment, but hopefully in other browsers pretty soon. And one final thing, oh my God, I can't believe I'm actually running to time. I deliberately talked fast. One last thing, Masonry. We have a proposal for Masonry layout in CSS. I know you've been waiting 10 years and forgotten all about Masonry, but it's back. So I can't show you any working code for this because it's still completely up for discussion. It's just a proposal. But if you head over to the WebKit blog, you can see a few examples. So if you don't know what I mean by Masonry, basically a grid where if instead of having elements placed neatly in rows, where they're all kind of pushed up against each other like this, kind of like brickwork, hence the term masonry. So this is kind of your typical masonry grid. And to be honest, I wasn't all that excited about the proposal when I heard about it, because I was like, okay, wasn't that fashionable 10 years ago? And do we really need that? Does anyone want to build masonry layouts now? But actually, like reading on the WebKit blog about the proposal, there's a lot of potential here. I think like we could size columns. You have different sizes, like columns in our masonry grid. We could size our columns according to the content, or we could make certain items span multiple columns as well. And I think it would actually be really, really awesome to be able to do this in CSS. I mean, before we would have to use a JavaScript library for that. And, I don't think we should be using JavaScript for our layouts. I think JavaScript should do the things that JavaScript is good at and not the things that should handle the layout of our web pages. So if you head over to the WebKit blog, this is a short URL for it, read about the proposed syntax and have a look at some of the demos. It's still, there's kind of two different proposals. There's a proposal for it to be part of the grid specification, and then other people saying, maybe actually it's its own thing and shouldn't be part of grid. So it kind of has like bits of grid, bits of flexbox in a way. And there are still issues about accessibility and tabbing order. But the people, building this stuff and proposing this stuff, they really care about your feedback. They care about ironing out these issues. They want to know how you would use this and how you want to see this masonry syntax. And I'm quite hopeful about the future of CSS layout, because I think, over time, layout has got, designs have got a little bit maybe less ambitious as common patterns have been established. And we've maybe been a bit more focused on building quickly and also building with performance in mind. So we don't want to be importing JavaScript libraries for layout, which, is fair enough. I don't want to be doing that either. But I think maybe, as a result of that, we haven't been kind of designing these exciting layouts. And maybe it's time to start thinking about that a bit more. Like CSS has so many superpowers now. There's really not much limit to what we can do. So I think let's start getting more ambitious and more creative with our layouts again. And rather than being restricted by the browser, let it help us, leverage its strengths. And it enables us to work with dynamic content and unknown browsing conditions. And those things, I think, should be exciting rather than us seeing them as limitations. So thank you for listening.